Thank you for having me.
I think we'll get started in about 1 minute. But I wanted to introduce myself. I am one of the co facilitators for your room. I'm Jenna Davis. I am an EL coach for Metro Nashville Public Schools. So I am honored to get this chance to collaborate with you today.
Absolutely. I know we're Twitter friends out there in the Twitter space, I believe. So it's always good to see people in the real realm.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited to be here today, this Saturday morning.
All right, we got Mike.
Before we start, could I just ask what it is behind you, Mr. Hughes?
It is one of the murals here, and I'm not sure if you are in Nashville or not, but it is one of the murals that were painted at Napier Community Center. In I guess you would consider that south-ish Nashville, right around from downtown. But it's a mural that I really liked.
Jenna, would you like for me to get started?
Go ahead.
Hey guys, Mike Mitchell, Ashford Hughes, we're so excited you're here. Ashford, as you guys know from the recordings, is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Metro Nashville Public Schools. And my job is to kind of help get this conversation started. The thing that I loved about what Ashford said was, having lived and grown up in Nashville Metro Public Schools, I'm more interested in talking about, I'm more open to talking about sexuality, which is the most uncomfortable conversation that was in my personal household as a kid, than I am in talking about race, where I was in a relatively diverse setting at Martin Luther King back in the early 1980s. I mean, in the 1980s and 1990s. And that hit me because I was at least in a place where I had a Black principal, Dr. Samela Spence Jr., who was having those conversations, and it was still hard. And that's the thing that hit me most about what Mr. Hughes said in his talk, is that we will have all of these conversations that you would think would be way harder to have than just saying, hey, what is this thing about my color, my skin versus his color versus skin? But we're ready to dive into these what seemed like way more complicated conversations. But what he really pointed out is that certainly in Nashville, the fabric of our city and talking about race was the thing that hit me most. Jenna, what was the thing that hit you most about Mr. Hughes?
I was going to say the same thing. I also grew up in Nashville, but I went to a private school in Southeast Nashville that was pretty diverse, but race was never spoken about, even though half of our student body was Black. We never talked about those things. And, I've seen on Twitter before where it's like, tell me when you first had a Black teacher or professor. And I don't think I had an educator of color till college. And so it's just those things that really stick out to me is, how did I grow up in a school that was diverse, but we never spoke about race?
Mr. Hughes, if it's okay with you, do you want to open it up to questions, or would you like to say something to kind of get us started off this morning?
I'll make a quick, my personal value statement, but then jump into your questions, especially. So thank you all for having me. The way that I show up in this space, I also served 4 years within the mayor's office as a chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, looking at these issues from a global perspective. The mantra that my office within Metro Schools leads with, that we focus on fixing injustice, not kids. And I think that's vitally important sometimes, that we always are trying to figure out ways to fix the kids, get the kids to do these things. But are we fixing the injustice that many of our kids come and show up in here with? And that's what the energy that we're going to continue to project, because we can't expect those parents and families that have been marginalized, that live at or below the margins, to solve for these issues without the support, without the intentionality and dedication of those system leaders. And I think now more than ever is the time that we can do that. So I am anxious. I am really fired up about building the networks, collaborating to build the equity champions that tackle race head on, because race is an important element of difference, along with sexuality, along with disability. I think all those things have cross-sectionality, but we have to be intentional. We have to raise the bar and the expectation of what we do address. But I think educators now are ready to take that on. So I'm glad that you're here this afternoon. But if you ever see me in the streets, if you ever see me on Twitter, anywhere, know that I'm always going to talk about fixing injustice, not kids.
With that, I know that from the early conversation we had before Mr. Hughes was here, I know that there's a lot of you all have questions to get going. So if anyone just feels it, go right for it. David, I'm really excited because Mr. Hughes seems like your guy with your specific interest in wanting to kind of do that. Would you mind starting with that question? Because he's the guy that can make it happen, I think.
Sure, thank you. Again, Mr. Hughes, my name is Davin Ogletree. I am a special education teacher here in Nashville at Lakeview Elementary. My question basically is, as a Black male educator myself, only in my third year, how can I, on the ground level, get involved in sort of like a pipeline for other Black male educators here in Nashville or even in other major cities, right? So like if I move to North Carolina, how can I get involved there about finding out what the demographics are for hiring and recruiting and retaining other Black male educators? Because being, one of two Black males in my building in education, and even as a substitute teacher, I was only, one of very few within Metro Nashville that were Black males at the elementary level. So basically, my question is, how can I get involved in ways to recruit and retain Black male educators at the elementary level?
I mean, I think great question. And as you know, our district is kind of leaning towards how do we make intentional efforts to recruit teachers and educators of color. One of the things that we're working on right now is a partnership with an organization called TECA, Teaching Educators of Colors Association, something along those lines. I'll put it in the chat. But working with them on the statewide scale in order to look down and drill down what can school districts do to partner with our historically Black colleges and universities. We have 4 here in Nashville alone. What can we do to really partner with them to create that pipeline? And what does that pipeline look like? There are other ways, we are trying to find educators that come in our buildings that may not have the foremost teacher certifications, but how do we work with an American Baptist college that has a program called SEAL, Social Justice, Equity, and Leadership Institute, and how do we get those individuals in a program that they may not come in with the teacher credentials, but over time we can get those individuals built up to have those credentials. But we have to think outside of the box and be intentional about our partnerships. With that TECA partnership, there's another organization I'm sure you know, Ed Trust. And the Ed Trust of Tennessee is working with TECA in order to work with local municipalities on how do we create these pipeline of educators. Right now, when I talk to my Black male friends that are either going in education or looking in different spaces, oftentimes it's about the resources and being able to have the salary in order to feel like, hey, this is the career profession that I want to go into. And other times people want to see, what is my trajectory for leadership? Will I be in an entry-level position for so many years and not be able to rise up in leadership? And I think those are some of the questions we in Metro Nashville and around the country have to answer. But I think we have to be intentional about seeking out different teachers, different programs across the country that specifically address that Black student, that Black teacher, Latinx, Kurdish pipeline to get those professionals into our school building. And I'm going to be reaching out to you as we are working now with an organization or with a program in our schools called the Rites of Passage, which speaks to mentorship, but it's also reaching out to different faith leaders, different community organizations that are really have a lot of Black men in them to figure out ways that we can increase that pipeline. Good morning.
I'm also one of your Twitter followers, Mr. Hughes.
Okay.
I'm wondering if MNPS is working on or has some kind of plan to assess the culture of schools as how friendly they are to teachers of color, or what can be done to make sure that our schools are welcoming and valuing of our teachers of color.
So I know you all are familiar with, and I'm sure this is happening in every state, but we have the panorama surveys that are going out. We've done some other assessments, but as you all know, this is a time when people are probably feeling like they're over-surveyed. So our responses aren't like getting the upwards of the percentages that we need right now. I think when I look at what I'm working with educators and community folks across our district to create our equity roadmap, when I look at our framework, which is around culture, practices, and leadership, culture, like any organization anywhere, is vital to the sustainability of the employee base, actually the feeling of belonging for students and teachers. And we're trying to find ways, how do we incorporate cultural practices, cultural understanding in the leadership models, in the questioning that we give when we hire people. I cannot say again, when I look at other schools, when we visit the charters, when we visit the privates, when we visit the faith-based schools, the culture, they focus first and foremost on making certain that that culture permeates throughout the building and it seeps all the way down into that classroom. Everybody understands what that expectation is, from the families on to the teachers. And I think in MNPS, we're at the point in time now where we have to make certain that culture and the way that we create a culture is vital to our existence, and understanding this is how we create new norms. So right now, working with our HR department, working with our executive directors and our chiefs to really look at how are we, like what is currently taking place now, and what, based on research, based on social science, do we need to be working on moving forward in order to create a culture where our students of color, where our students with disabilities feel a sense of belonging, but also our employee base, right? So many of you know in Nashville, our student population is 70% African-American, Black or brown students, but our teaching core is about 80-20 opposite, right? So why are we not, sometimes I think equity work is about asking questions differently. So instead of saying, hey, we need to go ahead and get these teachers, but why are we not retaining teachers of color? What are we doing that we're not recruiting teachers of color? Why are they not coming into our district, right? And I think that culture, those expectations are vitally important. So we don't have everything written in stone right now, but these are questions that Dr. Battle is charging us to work on right now. And this is why I'm a big believer in co-creating spaces, co-creating processes and procedures. And we want to bring many of our Black Latinx teachers in to really sit down with and write out a plan of action together, not just coming from the central office on down and telling you this is what we want you to do, but incorporating those practices where we co-create, co-design a liberatory design process so that we get everybody's insight. And we just don't have that data to say we have it, but the data has to influence our actions. So hopefully we recognize that culture, practices, and leadership create the type of new norms in our school district. So I'm leaning towards us really putting a strong effort over the next months going into the summer as we start back 2021 in the fall of really elevating culture as essential to creating the new norms in our school district.
And I do want to honor that we have an educator from Baltimore here. And so
Okay.
What's great is what you're saying is applicable to Baltimore City schools and the DMV in general as well.
If I could say something, I always like to also say that a lot of my conversations and the work that I'm dealing with in education are rooted in the research, rooted in the social science and the lived experience. And Baltimore is a place that I really am fond of, because for many of years I've worked with the Annie Casey Foundation. And I know the Annie Casey Foundation, there was just a report that I was reading this morning via Twitter about the work that they were doing with Baltimore school system, incorporating social emotional learning practices, creating better culture, particularly around Black and brown students, that I thought was really spot on. So I know Baltimore is doing great work right now. And I know just like Nashville, we are on a journey, right? So for everybody in Nashville, we are on a journey and we are just really beginning this work. So, it's just like the evergreen that's stuck in the canal, like me pushing it by myself, trying to get it free. It's going to take some time. But if we're intentional, if we're dedicated to the work and we all are willing to have self-evaluation about the way we show up, I think we can get some change done quickly.
Leah, one of the things that popped into my head was you were talking about as a pre-K teacher, how can you create those norms? And so when Mr. Hughes said norms, that really connected me to what you had said. And Danielle, it also, when I heard him talking about culture, talking about what Baltimore's doing with, it really stuck with me that you're here. You'd said you were here to kind of reignite that joy. And I know that a lot of the other people that had said stuff too, but those were just the two things that stuck with me. I'm not asking either of you to speak if you don't want to, but those things clicked with me in what you all had said.
Actually, yeah, I was thinking about that too. Being a pre-K teacher, social emotional learning is like priority number one. And I've faced a couple different curriculums. I've taught in different states, and I kind of struggle with the social emotional curriculum being whitewashed in a way, or I don't know how to say it, like more like a simulation, like, okay, we need to have calm and quiet voices, like we have to problem solve by using our words. Like the home life of any child is going to be different, and the experiences that any child has at home is going to be different than the classroom. And I feel like a lot of the places that I've taught just have this assumption of this is how you problem solve, this is how you calm yourself, like self-regulate. And I was wondering if you had any resources or suggestions on how to like look for more culturally appropriate approaches to social emotional learning.
Yeah, I'll share those with with the Ed Cooperative here as well. I equate it to this, right? So, I'm a hip hop head, grew up with that. And it's like a DJ, right? So I consider educators to be DJs. You all know when you go out to a place when the DJ is bad, the mixes aren't right, it's off, the music may be too loud at different points. I equate educators, even though we have a specific curriculum, like be the DJ for that classroom, right? You have to take control and onus to say, even with pre-K kids, to say, look, I'm going to mix and infuse these different opportunities to engage my students differently with different curriculum. I'm a firm believer, and I understand in Tennessee, we're under specific state guidelines, right? We can teach to a core standard, so to speak, but I think we can use our own DJ skills, our own cultural responsive teaching mechanisms to make certain that we're blending different lessons correctly together to achieve what we want to achieve. I think that's where building the base of support within that school building in order for your principal to champion that work that you're doing, right? To really understand, I'm going to infuse and I'm going to utilize what the core instruction is. I'm going to teach to the standard, but I think I understand my students better because I built relationships with my students to understand this is going to work differently. Here in Nashville, we always talk about, or Dr. Battle has been talking about creating that personalized learning experience, right? And we know that just like with different music, we don't want to blend every student into one specific genre. So I think as educators, we just have to be, and I hate to use this word, we have to be courageous enough to say, like, look, I'm in this classroom, I'm building relationships. I know my students. I know that this is going to work differently for these 3 students as compared to these 6 students. So I think there is specific organizations out there that have particular curriculum insights. Learning for Justice is one that has a lot of different examples on what to utilize. I'll share with those as well, but I think we just have to, redefine for ourselves, what does it mean to be an educator in this space? And I think we have to be comfortable with being brave to say, you know what, I'm going to go outside of the box and do some things that I know is going to connect with my students. At the end of the day, your relationships are going to be invaluable to them. And I think that's where, you being, utilizing your DJ skills, so to speak, in order to reach your students is going to be invaluable. I'm going to stop sharing my virtual background because I see what time is up, but there are 2 books that I do want to recommend that help with that process. One is called No More Teaching Without Positive Relationships. This is an important book to read. It should be in everybody's toolkit. The other one is by Goldie Muhammad, Cultivating Genius, another book that is about being the DJ in your classroom and cultivating what students need. The last one is, a global book, Courageous Conversations About Race, right? These are 3 books that I think need to be in your toolkit in order to really understand where you are and how you can reimagine what being an educator is for our students, right? When I think about it, go ahead, is it time to switch?
Yes.
It's time to
Okay.
flip that record, Mr. Hughes. Sorry, man. We're going to the next one.
Okay.
Thank you so
Appreciate you.
much.
Thank you.
All right, y'all have a good one.
You too. All right. Hey, everybody. We are here with Dr. Ellington, wanting to be super mindful of time. We are going to be together for the next 19-ish minutes. So I want to invite people to unmute, shout out your
All right, looks like they're doing the whisking away and everyone's going to start joining us in a second. We will be hearing from Ashford Hughes when he joins us. He is the Executive Director of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion for Metro Nashville Public Schools, and he should be joining us momentarily.
Good morning, good people. Good morning.
All right, looks like we're all here minus Mike, but we can go ahead and get started. Did anyone have a quote from the video that struck them from what you heard, or any question you'd like to start off with for Mr. Hughes?
Can I start, Ms. Davis, with my value statement again?
Yes.
I just always like to start with my value statement. First of all, thank y'all for waking up this Saturday morning to be a part of this. I know many of you have kids and other responsibilities, but this is so vitally important. So I serve as executive officer for diversity, equity, and inclusion here within Metro Schools. Previous to that, I served in the mayor's office for 4 years as the same CDEI officer doing this work. The way that and my mantra within my office and the energy that I bring is that when we talk about this equity work, when we talk about culturally responsive teaching instruction, I start off with, like, I am here to make certain that we fix injustice, not kids. I think that's vitally important because oftentimes we're trying to solve issues with kids that have been put in place by the system. And I think we need to take a global look at how are we fixing injustice that many of our student subgroups come into, and how do we address them head on in order to provide our students with that personalized learning experience that they need to reach their ultimate academic goals and social success. So I wanted to really start off with that. That's my value purpose of that. Whenever you see me at the grocery store, whenever you hear me talk, I'm always going to lead with that mantra, fixing injustice, not kids, because that is the space that I think we in Metro and globally in education really need to start from.
Mr. Hughes, the thing that hit me the most, we talked about it in the other group, was just growing up in Nashville. My family talking about sex was just a taboo thing, but they would much rather talk about sex than race. And so that's the thing that hit me in the video that we all watched, was this idea that in Nashville, we're willing to talk about everything else. Please give me LGBTQIA rights before we talk about that. And by the way, my kid's in GSA. I'm just saying that, like, that's what hit me about what you were talking about, is that idea of we want to talk about anything but this. And so, Jenna, what was it that kind of struck you in that?
Same as Mike, I grew up in Nashville, but I went to a private school in Southeast Nashville that was very diverse, but we also never spoke about race ever. It was always about turn or burn is what the quote was before chapel each week. And so something that's resonated with me that I've seen on Twitter is, when did you have your first Black teacher or professor? And for me, that was not until college. And how did I grow up in such a diverse school, yet half of our student body had no one that looked like them that taught them.
One thing I want to add to my comment that I didn't say at the last one, specifically speaking to that, is we often forget or don't place together there is cross-sectionality between race and LGBTQ, right? We have Black, brown, LGBTQ students that are experiencing multiple levels of discrimination, of bias towards them, right? But I think oftentimes we allow race to be that one that we say, well, I'm internalizing it. I'm not racist. My family didn't do that. So therefore, we should not be dealing with this. And I think that is something globally, but especially here in the Nashville nice city that we live in, we really have to address head on, because many of our student groups, African-American, Latinx, we have LGBTQ members within those areas of difference that we have to address as well. So I wanted to say that so it doesn't seem as though we're pitting Black students' needs versus the needs of LGBTQ students. There's a cross section of all of that together.
So it's wide open, y'all. Just feel free to ask Mr. Hughes whatever's on the top of your head.
This is Melinda. I do have a question for Mr. Hughes. So, beginning of this year, my principal wanted us to, I guess in the wake of like George Floyd protests, to have discussion on or have something happen in our school relating to race and injustice and stuff, and ready to go, but then it got pushed aside because of training the staff on these virtual platforms, on Teams, on Schoology, and try to restart it back in January, but then just more stuff. And I'm willing to do things less, I guess, not within school, to do things outside of school, but it really needs to be in the school. So what is happening, I guess, at the district level so that we can make this a priority at every school?
Absolutely. First of all, good to see you. I hope the family is doing well. Great question. I'm going to share in the chat. I presented to the board a couple of weeks ago, kind of like the vision around what our equity roadmap looks like. I think for your purposes, when I work with the social emotional learning team and at the district, I think I always want to safeguard us jumping into conversations about race without having set the groundwork up ahead of time, because every school is not in the same place. Every educator hasn't had the specific self-awareness to really address that in a manner. And sometimes you all know that you can start down a road on something you're not prepared for and make the situation worse, right? So we don't want to do that. So as Nashville, as MNPS, we are really on the beginning of our equity journey. Our past superintendent kind of had a conversation around Title $1 and those resource assessments, but we didn't really get to the fundamental components of looking at ourselves, addressing what does implicit bias mean, what does racial equity mean, what does educational equity mean, and how do we get there along a journey, along a continuum. One training, one study does not make us prepared to have these conversations. Let me lay that groundwork first. So I think what we are trying to do right now is really over the next several months, over the next year, really do an assessment of where our schools are, where our educators are in this process. And I think right now, because we are very Nashville nice, we really haven't had a quality conversation about race, about class, about sexism in our schools. We do some things here and there, but it hasn't been consistent and it hasn't been over a period of time. What I have proposed and have been working with Dr. Battle and other leaders, because we all know it starts at the top, but it must be infused with the understanding from all of our students and all of our teachers and families. And that's why I believe in a co-created process. So we're trying to develop now what our roadmap looks like. And our roadmap is consisted of a framework around an equity lens, by which, how are we looking at the way we make decisions? How are we looking at the way that we assess success or not within the decisions that we make? But our framework is grounded in three core areas: culture, what are our strategies that were institutionalized from central office to the classroom to create a quality belonging culture? What are the practices that we're institutionalizing and implementing from the district office on down to the classroom that makes a student have that personalized sense of education, that sense of belonging? And what does the leadership look like? How are we keeping people accountable? That's a word in MNPS that everybody is kind of, accountability, what does that mean? But it is something that is not always punitive, but it speaks to, am I clear? Am I aligning it with what you've told me in the past? Am I coaching you up? And then what can I do to support you to get there? Where we are right now is really aligning what our roadmap looks like. I'm cultivating and trying to bring people together, cross-departmental together, teachers to say, we must have a conversation about race. We must have a conversation in our classrooms about culturally responsive pedagogy and what that looks like. And we must have a conversation about how we're building relationships in the school building, in the classroom, and outside with our families, with our communities, in order to reimagine, and I'm gonna say reimagine because that's the word we're using, but I mean to dismantle the education system that hasn't served all of us. So you'll be hearing more over the next coming months about how we're creating professional developments for our principals, for our teachers, that will be a professional development that is continuous over time. And we can show within the MTSS process how we making certain that we're creating mindful leaders, that we're creating equitable leaders that can address these issues, right? And can be mindful about how they show up when they interact with students based on some of these issues that they're dealing with. So we're just at the brink of that. I know I've had some schools that want to jump into it, right? And they want to talk about white supremacy. And I'm like, you all haven't even addressed bias within yourself. You all haven't even addressed some of the issues within the school. Let's not jump in a situation we're not prepared for. So that's why I'm asking for everybody to, let's go on a justice journey of sorts so that we can map out where we are and where we need to be. Long way of saying we're in the process of co-creating this with teachers, principals, educators to put that in motion.
And I had a question dropped for me in the chat. It says, how do you balance long and short-term goals in the classroom? If I'm doing culturally responsive pedagogy and deviating from standards, am I helping students be ready for the next year when a teacher doesn't share this philosophy? How do we meet students' needs? And sometimes this might result in lower test scores because there's less time on prep, and the result is scripted curriculum being pushed down.
Man, great question. I know I work with the C&I team, curriculum and instruction team, and they are actively looking at ways that they can infuse, culturally responsive education in there and teaching practices. I want to give an example of what I gave in the last group that I was in as well. So again, being a hip hop head, I equate things to music and hip hop. So if you're a DJ, and we all know what a bad DJ is, when they don't mix things together, when the music is loud at one time, when it should be a little soft at different times, I think you all are, educators are the DJs of the classroom, right? We can teach to if it's a rave party, we can understand the music is for ravers, right? But within that classroom, we can use different techniques. We can use different strategies to teach to the common understanding of what we are. We don't have to deviate from what the core standards are that the state, even that the district is expecting, but we can utilize different strategies. We can utilize different techniques that infuse a student's culture, that infuses a student's understanding of where they are. We can utilize different strategies to get there that are culturally responsive, right? Even though we may be reading from To Kill a Mockingbird, there are different techniques that we can utilize within the lesson plan of To Kill a Mockingbird that can infuse culturally responsive understandings. But we as educators have to do a deep dive in ourselves to understand who our students are, to understand their culture, their background, to be able to infuse these type strategies. For instance, I'll tell you one example. From my perspective as an African-American male, have gone to Baptist churches infused with a lot of, it can be very, what some people may say, sensory overload, right? So if a student has that experience in church, right, and comes to school and he's, sensory overload because this is what they respond to, that is not to say that, oh my God, Anthony is out of control because he likes to stand up and do his work, or he is, emotional sometimes. That says culturally responsive. Maybe I should pick Anthony with a group and they go to the board and work in a tandem of a group together and work off a whiteboard or somehow together, work off a script together. There are different techniques that we can utilize as educators that we just have to be risk takers in order to achieve that. And it's not going against what the standard is. It is saying, I understand and I've built a relationship with my students to know what is going to be successful for them. And I recognize that each of them has a different background, and I can kind of champion that to bring out the best in them. I hope that was a way of answering that question.
And we have about 5 minutes if anyone else has a question for Mr. Hughes.
I'm gonna take my background down again. I'm gonna share like I did with the last group. These are a couple of books that I'm gonna share that can help you along that journey when you talk about how do I create the cultural responsive teaching to mix in with the core instruction that I have to have. This book is titled No More Teaching Without Positive Relationships. This should be on every educator's desk because positive and essential relationships are key to classroom instruction. This second book is Cultivating Genius by Goldie Muhammad, another book that speaks to how do we get to where we want to be in the classroom, teaching to common standards, but utilizing culturally responsive pedagogy to get there. And the third one is probably, a longer read, something that we're going to be working to over time, but Courageous Conversations About Race. This is something that these are like 3 essential learnings, tools that we all need to have in our library in order to make certain that we're moving in the right direction. One of the last things that I'll say is I'm a big person, a big believer in storytelling and narrative. I think it is vitally important as educators when we do embark upon something new. That's why I go back to Melinda's question about what are we doing. We have to clearly and often articulate our why. Why is this important that we're utilizing this instruction? Why is it important that we're having conversations about race and class in our school buildings? We have to understand our what, then what are we going to do about that? What are we seeking to accomplish with this? And then we have to clearly understand and articulate our how. How are we going about doing that? I think that raising the level of communication with families, with students is vitally important in creating that culturally responsive space that can address all of our student needs. And I think as educators, many of which who may not come from a background that has often participated in cultural events with African Americans, Latinx, Kurdish, it is incumbent that we also do the learning. We actually sit in with community and get to build with community outside of just technical learnings, but we grow that space together with community. And our communities, and I hate to say of color because that individualizes and sometimes it hides certain communities, but communities of color are embracing of those that want to come in and appreciate the culture that we are and appreciate that and value us in order to infuse that. I would challenge all of our educators to really get to know your students, their families, and find ways to build those and cultivate those relationships in the school building and outside of the school building so that students really understand you value them and you care for them in a different way. Students will run through a brick wall if you do that for them.
Looks like we have just a few seconds left. Ashford, I love that idea of the DJ. I love the idea that there are certain tunes we're going to have to play, right? Dr. Battle's going to ask for some tunes. The Department of Ed's going to ask for some tunes, right? The bride's dad's going to ask for some tunes, but then there's these other thing is like, but then they come to us and say, hey, but we want everybody on the floor dancing. We want everybody
and some of them, they just can't tell a joke. They're just terrible, but once you learn how to tell a joke and, get your timing and the reactions, that's a place to begin and start with them. I think we're being booted into other places, so.
I'll stay and
We'll be
listen to you too. Good morning, everybody. Jackie, hey, how you doing?
Excited to be here. How about you? I've been hearing lots of good things from you lately, and I just want you to know that the book you recommended the other day, is it Jamal here? Did I make that up? You recommended it, and the library just emailed me that they ordered it. Yes.
I was going to talk about it in the talk today.
Okay, the library has ordered it. It's coming.
I'm going to thank my mother for talking to you and sending you those good remarks about me. So I owe my mother dinner sometime soon.
Mr. Hughes, if you'd like to do your intro,
yep.
And then Jen and I will.
Thank you all for being here. I'm in the district serving as the executive officer for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Spent 4 years prior to this in the mayor's office, the same chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer working on these things globally. But in education, in generally, this is my mantra that I lead with, and I'm asking and championing at the district level when we do our equity work, is that we lead by this mantra. We are focused on fixing injustice, not kids. And I think that's a vital mantra, because too often we work on trying to fix and remedy what's wrong with kids and families that have been either marginalized or left at the margins historically. And now is the time that we restructure that power, that understanding dynamic, that we need to fix the systems and the conditions that have led to these student groups being marginalized, right? So again, fixing injustice, not kids. Whether you see me at the grocery store, anything on social media, or whenever I lead a discussion, I always start with that understanding, because I want to get that out front first, is that's what my role is, to champion those conditions that recreate that. And that is a paradigm shift, but it is something that we must begin to have the energy every time we show up. Fixing injustice, not kids. Thank y'all for having me this morning.
The thing that hit me the most in your talk, Mr. Hughes, was this idea of, in Nashville, there's this idea that we want to talk about everything except for race, right? Like growing up as a kid in a fairly conservative church, my parents would want to talk about anything except for sex, right? But even less than that, they want to talk about race. And so that's the thing that really hit me about it, and grew up in Nashville, that idea, that just unwillingness to really deal with this thing that seems like would be an easier conversation, but is the most difficult. Jenna, how about you? What was that hit you really from the talk?
I had a very similar connection growing up in Nashville as well. I went to a private school in Southeast Nashville that was very diverse, but we never talked about race. We definitely didn't talk about sex, because you were going to hell if so. And so just growing up here, and just where you see on Twitter, when did you have your first Black educator? And for me, it wasn't until college. And just thinking back on my experience K through 12, and how did I go to such a diverse school, and yet many of the students had no one that looked like them. And Mr. Hughes in our last room talked about how even the intersectionality of LGBTQ Black students, and not having someone that looked like them teaching them.
Yeah, I think that's an important understanding. Again, as we talk about levers of difference, which race is an element and a lever of difference, but that cross-sectionality between Black, Brown, LGBTQ members as well. I think sometimes we forget that is something that is a lived reality, but it is vitally important. Many of you know, if you're from Nashville, that we have this Nashville nice mentality, where we go to the meetings to discuss race, to discuss transformation and change, and everybody's, oh, my grade is so great, we're going to do this. And when we get to the parking lot, that's when everybody starts to cussing, and I'm not doing that. That's crazy. That woman ain't going. So we have to move beyond the Nashville nice to really sit down and assess how are we showing up, how is racism showing up institutionally, systematic-wide within our communities, right? I give two quick examples. Tennessee State University is, through research, through history, has been shown that the state did not provide them their federal allotment of state dollars, being a land grant college since the early 1950s, to the tune of almost $544 million, while the other institutions in the state still receive their allotment. That's institutional racism. That's systematic racism. I think those things, like, we cannot say that they are not true. So in public education in Nashville in the late 1950s, Hattie Cotton Elementary School was bombed because they were going to be one of the first schools to integrate, right? 1957, I believe it was. We see signs with pastors and other people saying, keep our schools white, right? We don't need to be race mixing in education. That is a history that should inform us in the data following that history on the institutionalized racism and disparities that we see that we need to address. And it is institutional, like the data, the lived experience are there. So hopefully now, like you all on this call today, many other educators within our city are looking at that history, that data, and that lived experience to now say it's time to disrupt, dismantle, and transform education to address the racial inequities that we see within our school building, which also correlates with classism, correlates with sexism, all of that.
And y'all, no longer, you do not have to be Nashville nice. You can just start asking questions with Mr. Hughes. He is ready to, these conversations have been rich because people are jumping in. So feel free to jump in with what hit you about his talk or what hit you with what he just said right then.
I'd just like to say thank you for allowing me to interview you for the fall. I really appreciate it. It was surrounding the school choice algorithm, and I'm excited that you are here with us today. If this is unrelated, please feel free to pass on to another panel or another person's question. But I do wonder what change, as the EDI officer for MNPS, like what change are you working on with Nashville schools?
So I tell you, and I'm gonna share in the larger chat, I presented to the school board like 2 weeks ago, the vision, the purpose, and the framework behind our equity roadmap, which is to take us from a school district that really is focused on how do we create that personalized learning experience for students, but also how do we create the leaders in our school building from central office all the way down to that first grade classroom, the leaders that are mindful about race, that are mindful about culture, that are mindful about the way that they show up and create an experience for a student so that student has the opportunity to reach their maximum academic achievement and social emotional achievement as well. So I'm in the process of developing that. And when I say I mean co-creating that process with teachers, principals, families, and students to make certain that we have a framework in place that will be sustainable over a period of time. One of the first efforts around that is to look at how do we create an equity lens by which we make decisions, by which we assess whether success looks like or not. This equity lens is essentially questions around the values that we say we believe in, right? We rhetorically say we care about education based off of these 4 or 5 reasons. Well, how does that show up in our decision making? How do we look at historically those students that have been left behind in our decision making, right? Then the real crust of the framework that I'm focused on as we look at leaders going forward is how do we create quality culture, culture of belonging, a culture of accountability within our classrooms? How are we creating the day in, day out practices within that classroom around instruction, culturally responsive, culturally relevant instruction for students? And how are we cultivating leadership in our buildings? Leadership that has a vision, leadership that has accountability, that folks are seeking the right opportunities for students. And that's leadership, culture, practice from central office, from Dr. Battle on down, right? And I think at its core, will it be a quick turnaround? No, but we have to infuse these now. So when I look at it, the theory of action, and I hate to say theory, because oftentimes we get caught up in the theory and the framing, but we don't actually get to live actual equity. But we have to create and we have to cultivate the system in order to go from one that keeps people marginalized to keep people liberated in education. But we also have to develop the leaders through professional developments, professional learnings, in order to cultivate those classroom opportunities. Right now, professional development has been, you get an implicit bias training once a year, way to go, right? But that's not changing the culture, the practices, or the leadership. Professional development in equity along the lines of culturally responsive teaching or along the lines of critical race theory has to be consistent. It has to be continual. And I think working with our MTSS system and process, we have to put in place the onboarding for every teacher that comes in, goes through this consistent training. But teachers that have been in for 30, 40 years need to go through those training processes as well. So we're trying to set that up to make certain that this is something that is not seen as a check the box. I'm not about check the box stuff. Like, we've done check the box stuff, right? We have to be transformative. And that means we're going to do these trainings over time so we can evaluate people. And with evaluation, it's not always punitive. Sometimes evaluation is saying, how can we help make you better? And we all need to be better. I'm not an expert, right? Many people, Gloria Lassen-Billings is an expert, right? But we all can find ways to grow and continue to have expertise in order to get the most out of our students, because my why is that our students demand it. We have kids for 13 years in our buildings. If we don't do our job well, then we don't prepare them for what's next once they turn 18 and we say, you're an adult now, right? So we have to prepare for that right now. So we're in the process of putting all of that together, kind of co-creating that space so we know what that looks like, and then moving forward. It's going to be a process, but it's not just up to educators. If the city isn't bought into this work as well, if our business leaders aren't bought into this work, if our faith and nonprofit communities aren't bought into this work, and we aren't working together, it's going to be tough and it's going to take much longer, because our students, education cannot solve for housing trends. Education cannot solve for the economic development in the market that is leading to displacement in our communities. Those that do have to be responsive to understanding how that affects our students coming in and their learning, right? Our students are coming in different places, and that's where, Nicole, I hope that we're trying to move forward, and would love to work with you on that. And school options is a #1 thing that I'm working on to make certain that we put more equitable markers in that process as well, as we've talked about. So I would be remiss if I didn't use my DJ analogy in this group as well, right? So when people say, well, you know, we have to teach to the core standard, and how do we get to being able to have different curriculum, and what does that look like? Because I'm being assessed on this and that. So I equate, you know, I'm a hip hop fan, grew up hip hop, 90s hip hop, you know, some of the new stuff I'm trying to get involved with so I can connect with my students. But when you think about a DJ, we all know what a bad DJ is. They don't mix well, right? The music isn't kind of infusing together. It's loud at some points when it should be soft. As educators, we can teach to a common standard, but we can use the different techniques, the different albums, in order to infuse that classroom instruction. We can have the core, but do we know our students well enough to incorporate who they are in the lesson planning? And a good DJ can infuse, mix and match, where one song goes into another song seamlessly. We can do that as educators, but we also have to be empowered to be risk takers, to be able to do that type of understanding and that teaching. But we also have to understand who our students are in order to be able to do that as well. So that means cultivating the relationships with students in the classroom, but also understanding that community outside of the classroom as well, in order to really get the true deep dive understanding of what culture responsive is. We can do all the book learning, but if we don't understand our students right now, you may not have a Snapchat, you may not have a Twitter handle, you may not listen to hip hop, you may not listen to R&B. But if you want to understand your students, you need to be getting a glimpse of what these things mean so you can have a conversation with your students. And that is where we can supplement, well, I have to read this, I have to read To Kill a Mockingbird, I have to read The Scarlet Letter. Great, that's what they say we have to read, but you can infuse some cultural different tactics in educating the students on the Scarlet Letter that they can relate to, that makes them feel like, okay, she used a hip hop reference and talked about the Scarlet Letter. She used a, whatever it may be. We have to be the DJs in the classroom to mix and mingle what we need to get across to our students in order to meet that common standard.
I think what you're saying, I'm curious how you feel that because I coach teachers at a charter school that is within Nashville and is a zone school for Nashville students. And I think one of the things we've seen and read in terms of like coaching practices to get teachers to do these kinds of things, like to think about all of their content through the lens of their students and feeling the control and ability to take the natural canon and make it more accessible or make it more relevant, that all of that comes with like consistent coaching over time, right? And so like that has to be a vision of the coaches and leaders in each building, which it sounds like is something you're trying to work through when you say,
Yep.
Like, is that what you see? Because I think what happens too is all of a sudden, when a new initiative comes in, coaching has to respond to that. Like all of a sudden, map data came in, this is where the kids are. Coach, come up with your plan for how you're going to support teachers to make this data before you know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of coaches have tried to talk about like, let's build a tech set around this that supports students. But then that never, almost like that sustained coaching just always gets dropped to the last thing based on what the acute issue is. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that.
So great question, Lindy. So I think that's where we have to reimagine what being an educator in education is, right? So I don't consider equity, I don't consider culturally responsive pedagogy to be another initiative. I think equity and the social emotional learning piece are foundational to a student's education, right? And again, I go back to the history and the data, right? The data over 3, 4, 5 decades shows us these students are not at mastery, close to grade level, or where they are in achieving, right? We keep doing these mitigative things like, oh, we have to do something else. We need to do what's foundational, right? And do that well, right? And let that foundational work play out to see, now let's look at what's going on, right? But the work of teachers, understanding in that those building of relationships, that fundamental understanding that equity is not this other initiative. We must do that every day, whatever it takes, every student, every day, if we want to see substantial changes in the type of student that we pump out. For instance, if a student cannot read in school, they are just sitting at a desk. So for 13 years, we're passing students that aren't able to read. What do we expect to happen to that student once they leave our building after 12th grade? I mean, the data and the stats can almost tell you where they're going to end up. So I think we have to, for once and for all, reimagine, re-understand, and reevaluate what it means for education. Like, do we ask ourselves, what do we really mean when we say we're an educator? Or what do we really want to get out of this educational experience for our students? Fundamentally, that means I need to provide specific coaching on the equity framing for all that we do year in and year out. And equity is not an initiative. We have to quit piling. That's why teachers are like, is this another one? I've been here for 3 administrations over the last 5 years. There'll be 3 more people here with another initiative. Equity has to be foundational to that work. And to be foundational, we must train our leaders on what equity actually means. People think equity, it's been co-opted, that everybody thinks it's all about equality. And we want equity is about justice and fairness and individualized supports for what a student needs. Equality is about sameness. Most of the time, people are talking about sameness when I'm talking about giving students that personalized support they need, right? coaching is invaluable. And respectfully of MNPS, because I'm hearing, and I have to be transparent as well, when I look at what's taking place at some of our charters and some of our private schools, the level of support and dedication they give to coaching around curriculum, classroom practices that are cross-disciplinary are vitally important. The support that a teacher needs to help a kid learn math and read, I don't think of that vastly different. But how are we making certain that that teacher has the tools in order to be culturally responsive to that teaching? How do we empower that teacher to utilize different set of teaching tactics to get there? I'm a 40-year-old man. When I'm at a workshop and you want me to sit down in a classroom at a desk for an hour to hear you tell me something, I'm on my phone, I'm doing something else. Imagine that same response from an 11-year-old who you have your back turned teaching a lesson to, right? We have to find ways that we can say, like, that's not working for me. How do I expect an 11-year-old to sit down in that same environment? Maybe we should put white paper up around the room and I have groups go over here and fill out the work, right? Oftentimes within my culture, African-American culture, when we attend church, it can be visually overly stimulating for some, right? But those kids go back into the classroom with that same understanding that, man, I go to church and it's, I'm up in praise and worship, and that's the type of energy they feel that they need to be engaged with. How do we understand who our students fundamentally are to provide them what they need? And coaching is important. Another book that I'm going to share in my last 57 seconds, Cultivating Genius by Goldie Muhammad. Get this book. This is another way that we talk about coaching and making certain that teachers have what they have to empower and understand who their students are. An important book, Courageous Conversations About Race, vitally important to move us beyond the Nashville nice and really get down and address race as not an individualized only phenomenon, but a systematic and institutional reality that many people live with. And this is the one that I talked about earlier. No More Teaching Without Positive Relationships. Get this book first. Read this book. This is a book study I'm going to be working with Metro Public Schools, the senior cabinet leaders on, because relationships matter and relationships help us get to where we need to be.
It's over. I'll get going on processing those videos and get them up as soon as I can and share with you. Welcome back, everybody from the other groups. So happy to see you back here. I think we're all wrapping up now.